Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let us march on till victory is won, and we'll cry glory, glory. Now the war isn't over and victory isn't won, but we'll fight to the finish, and when it's all said and done, we'll cry glory, glory. Oh, one day.
So many folks logging in for this session. My name is Sally McMillan. I'm a professor of advertising and public relations here at the University of Tennessee, and I'll be moderating this session. And it is about media and digital activism. We have 4 panelists. So our format today is we're going to start with each panelist giving a brief overview, about 10 minutes, of some of the work that they're doing in this area of media and digital activism. And then we'll have a little bit of time for the panel to discuss amongst themselves, but the last 20 minutes or so will be open for anyone to ask questions. So I think perhaps the best way to manage questions, since we've got a fairly large group, is to do it in chat, and you can start writing your questions at any time, and I'll monitor them. And when we get to the time for the audience Q&A, I'll pull from those questions that are in chat. So without any further introduction, let me just go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Devendra Potnis. He's an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. His research focuses on creating value for students, vulnerable populations, libraries, microfinance, and government agencies through information tools, resources, and services. Today's presentation on digital activism is informed by his diplomacy lab experience with the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, where he and his team of information science graduate students studied how social media can be leveraged by citizen journalists to fight corruption in Africa. So, Devendra, take it away.
Thank you, Sally, and thanks all for coming. My name is Devendra Potnis. I'm an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences, and today I'm going to talk about definitions of digital activism, different types of digital activism, and different types of challenges that are experienced by different types of users when they want to be part of digital activism. So it is a type of social activism which includes information and communication technologies for promoting social movement. Digital activism is also broadly defined as a collective action for a cause taken using technologies. Or it is an organized or individual level effort, by citizens to influence different types of issues using different types of technologies like internet, social media, robots, and so on. So there are 9 different types of digital activism. The first thing is clicking. It's very simple. You just like somebody, you upvote something. Now you might think that, just clicking something or some vote, some post, how does that make a difference? But imagine if you have like millions of followers or thousands of people supporting certain post, then essentially that post, that vote, that opinion lends, it gets legitimacy, validation, authority. The more people click, like your vote, like your opinion, like your video, the more validity or authority you gain in that particular field. The second type is voicing, where you essentially reinforce different types of ideas, values, information. So voicing is, it works like an echo chamber in on social media, and where you can share, retweet, repost, comment, anything. Now again, if you have huge social network, then that is a great way or great platform to voice your opinion and to spread the message. So there are different influencers. If those influencers on social media, if they support your cause, your activity, your idea, then you are likely going to gain a lot of support and outreach. So outreach is very important if you have huge social networks. And then asserting, so creating different types of videos, short videos. Now, whenever you create any video on YouTube, for instance, or Snapchat, or any other social media platforms, you are essentially trying to frame the message using your lens, your opinion. So you are presenting that content through your lens, and if people like it, then they are going to follow you. They are going to like your cause. They are going to support your cause. So that is the third type of digital activism. Now, while going through all these different types of digital activism, I want you to think about the different levels, the different types of uh, efforts involved, commitment needed, skills needed to implement or engage in these different types of digital activism. The fourth is online petitions. So it's basically e-government petitions, electronic government or digital government petitions, where citizens, they request a certain review of an issue, and that's how minimum number of signatures can lead to a guaranteed response. Uh, a threat here is, all the people who sign that petition, they need to follow the rules and regulations. They cannot make threats, death threats. If that happens, then that can jeopardize the cause of online petitioning. The fifth is bots, botting or botivism. So bots plus activism, where robots or different types of codes are used for spreading messages. And another concern here is, fake news can be spread, can be broadcast very easily using bots. And not many users are capable of distinguishing between bots and real people. So that's another downside of botivism or bots. The sixth is e-funding. So, using technology to raise revenue, to generate revenue for a cause. Mining cryptocurrencies, that is one very popular emerging way of raising funds. Now, again, the downside here is we don't know who is mining that currency and if there is money laundering involved in cryptocurrencies. Website retail click-through. So many times, if you shop, let's say, if your final bill is, let's say $82.80. So the website retailer would ask, would you like to add 20 cents? Would you like to donate 20 cents for this cause, XYZ cause? So that is website retail click-throughs. And then there is online auctioning where, the person or the organization would claim or would say that, whatever you purchase, that whole money will go to the cause, some specific type of cause. Data activism. So that requires a lot of commitment, time, effort, different types of skills on behalf of the organizations for opening up data sets. Again, the drawback here is if the data is not complete, if the data is not relevant or recent, then it's likely to going to create more harm than benefits for your cause. If you don't have that, accurate, or if you have fake data, for instance, or if the data is not grounded in facts, then open data sets can create a lot of trouble and confusion for the cause. Data leak. So I think all of us know WikiLeaks, unauthorized dissemination of confidential information. And then hacking. So hacking requires little effort, but a lot of skills. Again, I want you to bring back to the same criteria, the amount of time required, the different types of skills required for implementing activism, the commitment required for activism. So cyber terrorism, for instance, spreading virus, vandalizing websites, denial of service attacks, where so sometimes you, as a citizen, you would try to access certain websites, but that website or the server of that website is unable to respond to your request. And that's because in the backend, millions of attacks, millions of people or the clients or the computers are sending the same request over and over again to that server. And as a result, the server crashes. So, so that's cyber terrorism. Another type is, patriotic hacking, where so organizations or technology experts from one nation would try to attack or capture the servers or the websites located in the enemy nation. So that is a very high level type of technology related hacking. Now let's talk about the challenges, different types of challenges. So let's say, you are interested, you want to do, you want to engage in digital activism, but can everybody do it? Does everybody have the skills? Do you all have the time, the commitment, the psychological factors that come into picture? So let's take a look at those factors or the challenges. So digital literacy. So can you code? If you want to engage in botivism, or if you want to use bots that will work 24/7, can you sustain those activities? Do you have the infrastructure needed? Do you have the skills needed? Can you troubleshoot routers if you want to use social media, especially in developing countries? Then media literacy. So how do you use different types of platforms, social media platforms? Because all of these platforms have different types of features, right? And they have functionalities. So it's not enough to have login and password for that account. You should be able to exploit all the features associated with these social media platforms. And you should be able to identify which feature can be used or can be leveraged in the best possible way to attain your goal. So sometimes, information flow, influencing information flow is a goal, whereas sometimes creating outreach, huge outreach is a goal, or sometimes interaction is a goal. So there are different types of goals that are associated with your cause. So what do you exactly want to achieve through which platform, or which platform is the best suitable platform for your cause? The third is information illiteracy. So we all receive all kinds of messages on our social media accounts. So how many of us really bother to check the factual correctness, if they are accurate? How many of us are able to distinguish between misinformation and facts? How many of us have the time required to validate that information? How many of us really go to the source of that information before forwarding those messages? So that all comes under information illiteracy. Then cause illiteracy. So sometimes, many of us don't have enough time to read the whole petition, for instance, online petition. We just see the headlines and we would say, okay, I support the cause. But there are many contradictory perspectives, viewpoints under the same cause. So, you should have enough time and skills needed to verify, to understand, what exactly is the purpose of this petition. So looking at the topic is not enough when you want to engage in any kind of digital activism. So that is cause illiteracy. The fifth one is lack of security. So how comfortable do you feel engaging in any kind of social movements, and are you going to jeopardize your family's life or infrastructure or devices, mobile devices? Infrastructure means server. So if millions of people attack your server, so that is a threat to your server. Or data, data is very precious. So if people vandalize your data sets, can you afford to do that? Do you have the ability to take backups of your data sets? Then lack of trust. If people don't trust in institutions, organizations, cause, or the very cause of citizen journalism, then are they going to engage in this activity? The seventh one is faulty and missing open data set. So again, if data is not relevant, accurate, current, then it might not create the best possible return. So it's very important to ensure those aspects. And if you don't have the skills needed to make sure that the data is accurate, relevant, or trustworthy, then you should not be the person opening up the floodgates of that data set to the rest of the world. The eighth one is lack of supporting infrastructure. So timely access to different types of technology platforms. So sometimes, you need that platform right at that moment, to capture the videos and to broadcast it in real time. And if you don't have access to those platforms, or if you don't have enough data plans, bandwidth, then in that case, you miss the opportunity to report something very important in real time. So that could be a challenge to digital activism. And then these are my references. So I'll also share the link to my presentation if you are interested in downloading it. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Potnis. So that's a great overview of the tools and challenges of doing digital activism. And now we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is Allyson Ganster. She is an educator, organizer, and scholar activist from Houston, Texas. She's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, where she received degrees in anthropology and international relations and global studies. She has worked as a community scholar teacher with Black Sovereign Nation, an activist collective that seeks to create autonomy within Black communities. Currently, she is applying to PhD programs in anthropology in order to further her studies on the topics of surveillance, state violence, and Black liberation movements across the Americas, while incorporating a community-based ethnographic research model. Allyson's presentation today is informed by her undergraduate research on how Black women community organizers in the US and Brazil use social media in their racial justice and feminist activism. And I just want to repeat that for those undergraduate students who are on the Zoom call today. Ally's talking about undergraduate research. And so this is something that you can do as an undergraduate researcher. So I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thanks, Ally.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sally, for inviting me and to the University of Tennessee. And yes, as she said, this is something that I did as part of an undergraduate thesis research through the UT Austin Department of Anthropology Honors Program. So this project I'll be speaking about is an ethnographic study of the experiences of Black women activists in Brazil and the US, and the role that social media plays in racial justice activism. The purpose of my research is to understand the implications social media has for racial justice activism and Black liberation in a broader historical and transnational context. My methodological approach has been defined by Black feminist anthropology, which, as Irma McLaurin states, seeks to deconstruct the institutionalized racism and sexism that has characterized the history of the discipline of anthropology in the United States and Europe. So through this project, I kind of took a two-pronged approach. So first, I engaged in historical analysis, really to ground the work, because I think it's very important to understand the different ways, the different historical trajectories of the US and Brazil, and the ways that race operates in both of these societies. So I did historical analysis as well as semi-structured interviews and participant observation in Austin, Texas. And I also did fieldwork abroad in Pelotas and Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, in southern Brazil, to examine the effectiveness as well as the risks involved with digital activism at the intersection of racial justice. So my research begins with the historical analysis, and I was primarily comparing the city of Austin and Porto Alegre. So I chose these cities for a few reasons, which I'm going to kind of go through, and this is more of the historical side of my project, where both Austin and Porto Alegre are the capitals of their respective states, Texas and Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And they have majority white populations within these cities in otherwise very diverse countries. So second, while there aren't many US anthropological studies on Black women in Brazil, the work of my advisor, Dr. Kristen Smith, Keisha Conn-Perry, Kia Caldwell, and Erica Williams are exceptions to that. There are even less ethnographies on Black women from the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And this is for a few reasons, which I'm going to kind of get into, but primarily it's because of the Brazilian state policies of what they call whitening. and European immigration in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I just kind of want to give everyone a little background in case you're not too familiar with Brazilian history. But by the term whitening, or in Portuguese, it's branqueamento. Essentially, in Brazil, these policies created by the state and laws encouraged European immigration, especially after World War I and World War II. And they really encouraged miscegenation, which is racial mixing, because they believed that the white, quote unquote, stronger blood would erase the Black blood from the Brazilian population. So obviously we know that this doesn't work. That's not how genetics works. And today Brazil has one of the largest Black populations outside of Nigeria. So on the contrary, in the US, which is kind of the other side of this, as you know, we had segregation, and that was the opposite, in which miscegenation and that was illegal. So however, today we see that the results of the racial hierarchy in both countries is similar because of de facto or in practice forms of colorblind racism and discrimination. So a lot of the work on research, or even just the experiences of Black women or Black people in the US, are oftentimes done a lot in the larger, more diverse cities. So when you're reading ethnographies, which are anthropological works where the anthropologists will do interviews with people, a lot of these works are done in Chicago, New York, Detroit, Washington, DC. And Austin's a lot smaller, and it has, because of the increasing white population in Austin, I wasn't able to find many studies on Black women or Black people's experiences in Austin, but the political stakes of gentrification and forced displacement as a global phenomenon suggest that we should really conduct a lot more qualitative and quantitative work on the experiences of Black women in places such as Austin. And finally, the third reason why I am comparing these cities is to argue that the discourse of racial democracy, which is a theory created primarily in Brazil, that basically says that it's the idea that racism doesn't exist and everyone is treated the same. So thinking a lot of times when folks are talking about colorblind racism. And so I'm arguing that this idea, this racial democracy idea, can be applied to understand racial dynamics in Austin, and that a lot of people there have adopted this kind of colorblind perspective on race, and it leads to the idea that there's a racial harmony in Austin, but that really couldn't be further from the truth, which I guess I really got to learn because I'm not from Austin, and when I went there, I had a very different idea of the city, probably as a lot of people have, that it's a very kind of like hippie, weird, progressive city. But actually speaking to people there who have not had those, kind of fun experiences was really eye-opening. And so through my ethnography, I interviewed the women in Austin and in Porto Alegre and Pelotas on their experiences with racial justice activism and their thoughts on Black feminism and the role of social media in their activism. And so some of the interesting findings were that there's kind of a double meaning of place for a lot of Black women, both as in place in society and geographic place, that have especially influenced the ways in which social media is used and the type of racial justice activism and feminist activism that women are engaging in. And I also found that these social media platforms have the ability to make information a lot more accessible for these activists, and provide a space to collectively organize both in local and national settings, as well as transnationally. So working across borders and making those types of connections as, through globalization, all that, it's really important that folks are able to make those types of connections across borders. And finally, that social media serves as a way to counteract the interpersonal and structural violence that many of these women face as a result of their identity and their place in society. However, since social media platforms operate just as a digital public space, with that, so as Dr. Potnis spoke about, that there are risks involved with social media, and specifically security is what a lot of the people who I interviewed kind of talked about. So those risks definitely exist, just as they would in a physical space. So organizing through these platforms, as useful and available as they are, can also lead to instances of violence, particularly state-sanctioned violence, but also interpersonal violence. Because through social media apps and smartphone geolocation, your digital footprint is a lot more accessible and easily surveilled. Again, going back to that idea of the digital security. So in Austin, this post-racial perspective, quote unquote post-racial perspective, is being really disrupted and challenged as race and racism are brought to the forefront of conversations in almost all spaces, but especially in the digital realm, which we've really seen, especially with COVID-19. The proliferation of Black women's activism in particular has allowed race to really permeate Austin's politics, and I would also argue global politics, especially as we're seeing right now, which leads us to conclude that any discussion of the racialized politics of space, digital space, physical space, must necessarily include that gender analysis as well. From police brutality to gentrification, Black women, many informed by what they call a revolutionary praxis, are spearheading resistance efforts to address some of the most pressing issues within the city. And social media is a really essential part of these organizing efforts. And here, as well as around the world, Black women are reimagining rather than reforming the oppressive systems that impact their lives on a daily basis. And the same is also true for the women in Brazil, in Porto Alegre and Pelotas. So I really think that the future research should focus more on places that aren't considered to be diverse, or the quote unquote Black cities, Detroit, Chicago, that is in everyone's mind, because the experiences of women in places like Austin and Pelotas and Porto Alegre will allow for, I think, a much more comprehensive understanding of gendered racial dynamics. And lastly, I kind of wanted to just give some action suggestions for folks who may be wondering how they can get involved with movements like this one, the ones that I described, and ones that you've maybe been hearing about throughout Diversity Week or in the news or on social media. First, I want to say that I think that this work can't just stop at the digital activism. That's definitely a start, and how many folks are introduced to this. But it's really important to put the practice or put the theory, quote unquote, that we learn into practice. So instead of like taking what you read online about, abolition, mutual aid, whatever you're interested in, rather than just stopping at sharing, retweeting, it's really imperative that folks do something outside the internet if they're able, which I understand at this particular moment in time, that's really difficult due to COVID. But getting involved with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements doesn't just look like going to protests. So it can include a lot of things, like you can bring snacks for people, childcare, design flyers for a campaign, administrative work, cleanup crew. I know these aren't the first things that come to mind when you may think of activism or organizing, but they are undoubtedly essential. Not everyone can be on the ground per se, facing the crowds, risks of COVID, like I said earlier, and whatnot. But all those things I mentioned are essential components to organizing activism, which makes it, I think, more accessible to everyone. And no matter what you're interested in, you can find your role. Thank you.
Thank you, Ally. Some great suggestions there for action. And we're going to move now to Jasmine Roberts, who is a lecturer in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University. Her specific areas of expertise include public relations writing, campaign strategy, digital activism, global marketing, feminist media, and media effects. Roberts is also a TEDx speaker and currently involved in several projects investigating the implications of Black Lives Matter. Jasmine, thanks for being here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm having a bit of internet issues, so please let me know if for whatever reason you can't hear me very well. So for my part of the panel, I really want to hone in and talk about Black Lives Matter. More specifically, I know throughout this week, some of you have probably gotten a little history of Black Lives Matter, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate that. Why my argument is that I believe that digital activism really can be a tool for everyone, but specifically for Black youth to mobilize and to really talk about some of the injustices that they experience on a day-to-day basis. I recognize the term slacktivism, but I am in the camp of believing that digital activism can have real tangible change. And so Black Lives Matter for me is really a digital attempt to bring awareness to the systemic injustices against Black Americans. And it has really become a global movement on and offline. As some of you might know, this hashtag was created in July 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, excuse me. And I think it's important also to note that this hashtag was created by 3 Black women, 2 of whom are queer. And the reason why I say that is because oftentimes the Black Lives Matter intersectional framework is left out of media or dominant media discourse. So we hear a lot of rallying cry when it comes to the killings of unarmed Black men. And I recognize that there is a history in terms of why there is so much outrage that happens. But Black women are also being killed, unarmed Black women, unarmed trans women, Black women. So we also need to recognize that when we talk about Black Lives Matter. So surprisingly, Black Lives Matter was not a popular tweet 2013, 2014. There was a study by, I think, Dean Freelon and his colleagues that found that I think it was only 50 public tweets in 2014, in June 2014, excuse me. And then I think it increased to about 400 in July of 2014, but by August of 2014, which some of us can remember, that was around the time of the Ferguson protests. Now we're looking at 50,000 tweets in that month alone, where we're using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And scholars, again, attribute this to the Ferguson protests. So for me, what makes Black Lives Matter, and I might vacillate between saying Black Lives Matter and BLM, to me, what makes it so unique is its ability to obviously leverage social media to mobilize social justice awareness and action. So this is not to say that there hasn't been any other forms of digital activism in the past. In fact, there have been that traces back to the 1970s even. And if you are interested in that type of work, I can certainly send you that information. But Twitter in particular is a very popular social media platform among Black Americans. I believe a relatively recent Pew Research survey found that about 54% of Black Americans, or Black social media users, excuse me, believe that social media is an important tool for them to use in expressing their opinions about social and political issues. Now, we compare that to white Americans, where I believe the number is only at about 35%. And so this, as a Black queer woman and a scholar, it's not surprising to me, to be honest with you, this statistic, given the history of how the media has treated Black Americans. I think I have a quote here from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who many of us may know is the creator of the New York Times 1619 Project. I think this quote kind of captures what I'm trying to say here. And she said the following while speaking on a 1A podcast, which stands for just the First Amendment. She says, journalism is not stenography. The role of journalism is getting at the truth and providing context and analysis so that audiences know what the story means, excuse me. So Black Americans have never been able to prescribe to the belief of objectivity, because objective reporting is what allowed us, again, Black Americans, to be treated so poorly and not believed by the media and others. This continues to be the case. So again, just to reiterate this point, Black Americans are all too familiar with the ways in which traditional media have treated them and represented them. For example, there is an over-reliance on police documents and other systems of power when we're reporting, which consequently becomes the dominant narrative, which research shows tends to harken back to racial stereotypes and creates very limited ways in which Black Americans are covered, which again reinforces very disparaging narratives. And so furthermore, when we have predominantly white men who are making these editorial decisions in the newsroom, and that viewpoint becomes the dominant, narrative for, or the dominant, narrative for objectivity in journalism, it's no wonder why we have a problem here, and that Black Americans have turned to other media platforms to correct dominant narratives and
Jasmine, it looks like you
time.
Gotcha.
It really mimics. Oh,
we lost you for a second, but you're back. We're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. Where did folks last hear me? What was the last thing that was heard?
I think we only missed about 10 seconds, so just keep right where you're going.
Okay. I think I was saying how, you know, the type of digital activism that we see in Black Lives Matter really is rooted in the tenacious efforts of journalists of color from the past, that, you know, their work really spoke to the real experiences that Black people were having in society, or in a society that was eager to suppress, you know, those type of conversations about institutional racism, and we kind of still see that today. If we look at, for example, the late 19th century, more than 3,000, I think, Black Americans were lynched, and white people who were, or white supremacists who were often the perpetrators of these violent acts, they of course justified the killing of, or the lynching of predominantly Black men by saying that they were rapists, that they were assaulting white women. And so mainstream media actually reinforced this argument by having very jarring, you know, headlines. I think one I have in my notes here, more rapes, more lynchings, Southern barbarism. And again, this was to describe the Black male hypersexuality that was allegedly responsible for the sexual assault against white women. But we have journalists like Ida B. Wells, for instance, who worked very hard to counter these racist stories. And she launched an anti-lynching campaign, I believe, in 1891 or 1892, where she researched the true reasons behind the rampant lynchings of Black men. And she found that, you know, the lynchings were actually a systematic way of racial violence, right? And to control and prevent the social uprising of Black Americans during the Reconstruction era. So her work brought, you know, urgency to this form of anti-Black violence, and we see that, right, through Black Lives Matter in the very same way, except for the media tool is different. And so for me, the hashtag Black Lives Matter encourages a form of citizen journalism that provides an alternative space for Black Americans to correct the dominant media narrative about their racialized experience with tools and technologies that, you know, weren't available when Ida B. Wells was alive. And I like this term by Dr. Alyssa Richardson. She's I believe an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And she calls basically what I've been explaining Black witnessing, which is just a communication process that seeks to, you know, correct political and other dominant narratives about the Black experience. And we see this again through Black Lives Matter. And so one thing that I also kind of want to talk about really quickly is that we are seeing just such, how can I say this? An increase in support for Black Lives Matter. I believe now 2/3 of the country in the US supports Black Lives Matter. And I say seemingly because, you know, over the summer, we saw a lot of companies rushing to be on the right side of history in putting out Black Lives Matter statements. And yet many of these statements, honestly, were a really poor attempt at corporate activism. It really was just a, you know, performative allyship, woke washing. I know that's a term that's become very popular now, where, you know, you're kind of appropriating social justice activist language and discourse for marketing purposes. So it seemed like, again, all of a sudden companies cared about Black people when, you know, this move was perceived as highly hypocritical. So the public, you know, can't truly take all these BLM statements seriously if you have, for example, an all-white executive board, or you're not working intentionally to make sure that you have an inclusive working environment or work environment for minoritized individuals. So during a time when, you know, consumers are really demanding transparency from organizations, businesses who I believe wish to participate in corporate activism need to make sure that their internal operations and culture truly embody what they're putting out there in the statements, right? They should, of course, refrain from exploiting the timeliness of Black Lives Matter or the movement of Black Lives Matter through a poor attempt to, you know, maintain brand integrity or appearing woke to consumers. And again, companies really run the risk of drawing critics or critiques of hypocrisy and perhaps even more damage to their brand for not putting out meaningful corrective action plans that explain how they plan to address how systemic racism manifests within their own respective organization. And so all in all, I'm very excited for the time that we are living in, this renewed interest in Black Lives Matter, but it also comes with a tinge of I don't want to say critical perspective, but I guess I am just really interested in seeing where this takes us because it's been some ride since 2013. So I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thanks to all of the presenters so far. We have been, everybody's using just a tiny bit more time than we allocated, so we're running just a little bit late, but we're still gonna be fine. But what I wanna suggest is if you have questions for any of the presenters, go ahead and start putting them in chat now. And as soon as we finish with our fourth presentation, we'll go ahead and start with your questions. So our fourth presenter is the award-winning writer, activist, counselor, and basketball coach, Atlanta native Edward M. Garnes, Jr. He's the founder of From Afros to Shell Toes. Garnes has received the Atlanta Tribune Man of Distinction Award and Moderator of the Year honor from Chosen Media. He holds a BA in English Writing from DePauw, Master's in Psychology from the University of Tennessee, and Master's in Counseling from Michigan State. His seminal essay, Black Boy Blues Suite, a love poem to my father in E-flat, appears in the anthology, Where Did Our Love Go? Love and Relationships in the African American Community, edited by Gil Robertson. As a highly sought after commentator on activism, hip hop, Black identity, manhood, and popular culture, Garnes has appeared on Young Black Entrepreneur magazine, CNN's Headline News, BET, Fox's MyTV Network, Sirius Radio, CBS Radio, and allhiphop.com. Garnes co-stars in the internationally acclaimed documentary film series Elementary Genocide, directed by Raheem Shabazz. His national manhood tour, Sweet Tea Ethic, has featured famed brothers Dr. Cornel West and Clifton West. Garnes also stars in BET's acclaimed documentary Killer Curves, which examines the impact of popular cultural influences on women's body images. Ed, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right, so thanks for the wonderful intro. I am Ed Garnes. I am an activist by calling and also weird to be an activist. I'm a doctoral student here at the University of Tennessee. I'm in the psychology department, just passed my comprehensive exam, so I'm a little excited today. So I am, my research interest is in Black men, specifically gendered racism that Black men experience in white spaces like PWIs. So my thesis research and also my dissertation research deals with that. On the activist side, I'm the founder of From Afros to Shell Toes, an award-winning community organization that focuses on a few things. We focus on practical strategies for social change. So what does social change look like in real time? We try to make theories dance and take all of our book knowledge and apply that to real world issues. Personal development, also emotional healing, and we are definitely down with African-centered psych and responding to the psychological needs of Black folks. So what does that entail in real time? We do workshops, panels, we design digital marketing campaigns. We've worked with individuals like Spike Lee, Nikki Giovanni, who's here from Knoxville. But I want to talk about, I'm gonna be brief, I want to talk about 4 points that I think we need to talk about when we talk about activism and digital activism in general. Number 1, activism is a skill set that has to be fostered. Before you use any technology, you have to become educated in activism. So my education started very young. My mother worked as a librarian. My dad worked at the juvenile court. Both of them had master's degrees. But each summer, each weekend, I participated in voter registration drives. I participated in Black liberation psychology events. And so I've always been motivated to be an activist. So that's something that's a part of my DNA. It didn't just happen because it became popular. So activism is a skill set that we have to foster. Secondly, we have to educate ourselves on issues. You know, it does us no good to send a tweet, to get on Facebook or Instagram if we don't have an education about where we stand and an education about issues. So like the presenters were talking about with Black Lives Matter, before it became a catchphrase, I've always felt my Black Lives Matter. I've always participated in things that were for the uplift of my people. So being educated on issues allows us to use technology in different ways. And also we have to be ruled by understanding systematic change and how power and privilege is dispersed in America. So when we start to examine power and privilege, we're able to take an activist position, you know, that is progressive and not mimicking the status quo. Fourthly, I want to talk about digital spaces really reflect the value systems that you already have. So if you're using technology like Twitter, if you're using YouTube, if you're doing podcasts are influenced by what you already value. So people don't just become activists, liberation falls out the sky. There's normally some training that has happened to make this person an effective leader. So what does that look like in real time? So since COVID-19, I have been on the podcast circuit. I've been doing interviews about Black folks and cultural coping. So I just want to talk about some examples of activism in real time. So when COVID hit, a friend of mine, Kimmy Bennings, and I reinstituted our initiative called Porch on Peachtree, which is a series of videos, podcasts, and interviews that deals with personal development, emotional healing, and also how art can be liberating. And so during COVID-19, we did a series of interviews with artists and activists, and also just created and held space for people at this time of the Black Lives Matter movement and people being more interested in power and privilege and how it operates, giving people tools that they can use. Like, you know, one of the things that I have been emphasizing is prioritizing rest, especially in the Black community. We're taught to fight, to fight, to fight. We also have to prioritize rest and recovery. So that's one of the things that we talked about with Porch on Peachtree. I've also participated in an online suite of programs by Dr. Fahamu Piku, who is a visual artist and also a scholar out of Emory. He did the first visual dissertation in Emory's history, right? And so he works on representations of Black manhood in the media. So I did a series of interviews with him. That series was called Trapidemia. Also, I've worked with Black Men Smile, who started a campaign for Black Men Smiling and just basically showing the humanity of Black men. So I've lectured as part of that. I've also spent time lecturing with the Ash Academy out of LA, giving practical strategies of how to deal with this particular times. When we begin to use technologies, like I said before, technologies reflect our value system. So I'm an educator as well. And so I teach psychology, and I often incorporate YouTube videos, examine how people use things like technologies like Instagram. And so I incorporate digital media in my classrooms. When I taught at Spelman College, I actually got an award for, you know, just my classes and incorporating media and activism. And so that's something I do on a daily basis. But I want to emphasize that, you know, that value system came before these technologies existed. And so I'm happy to, you know, share my experiences. This marks 25 years of me being in higher education and being a professional journalist. So I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Awesome, thanks, Ed. So I'm going to start with the first question that showed up in the chat, and it's from Ellie Tidwell, and she says it's for any of the presenters. She'd like to know how you differentiate between actual activism on social media rather than performative activism. And I'll open that up for anybody. Any of the four of you. Want to take that? Just open your mic and give us an answer.
I'll try to.
Okay.
If you all can hear me okay, I just still feel so horrible about that.
No, you're great. You're fine.
You know, that is a very good question. It's a tough thing, right? For me, it's you know, consistency of that activism, but I get very hesitant to define clearly activism because it looks very different for people. So for me, writing is a form of activism, right? But we oftentimes operationalize activism in the very traditional sense, right? So we're out there protesting, we're making signs and all of that. I think there's a level of, you know, like I said, consistency with it, and then also, gosh, I'm blanking out on how I want to say this, but basically there's just a level of genuineness that I think people can also detect in that activism. So I'll leave it there for now. But yeah, I just want to reiterate that to everyone on this call or in this session, activism is going to look very different. The way that you participate in activism is going to look different from the way that Ed does, or the way that Ally does, the way that Dr. McMillan does. And so just keep that in mind when we're talking about the difference between, you know, performative social media activism, for example, and actual activism.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. I'm going to go ahead to the next question. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I think, you know, similar to Sister Jasmine's point, I think we sometimes put a hierarchy on activism, like there's a high point, a middle ground, and you're not doing it right if you do this. I think activism, you start where you are. I am of the opinion that I believe that activism has to be anchored in what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would call creative altruism, like things that benefit society just for the sake of serving society. And so I think activism has to have elements of that. And you also have to look at a person's record. You know, like Black Lives Matter should have mattered for hundreds of years, right? So if a person is hopping on that bandwagon, I'm looking at a history, right? So like if you were to Google me, or if you were to look up and talk to my professors, I have a history of activism in real time, and also a history of research. So I try to determine the feasibility of things I support based on people's record, based on consistency. And then we underestimate authenticity. Are you living it? You know what I'm saying? Are you a person that talks the talk and walk the walk? And so I don't get into judging a person's heart. Like I can't look in your heart and say you are performing, but I can look at a record and see if this is something that you've done consistently.
Great, thanks, Ed. I'm going to go into the next question, and this one is from Elizabeth Rose Campbell. She doesn't address it to anyone, so I think we can say it's open to all of you. What is the best way to have a conversation with someone about Black Lives Matter who is already defensive and angry? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I think, as I said in chat, it's important to understand and acknowledge someone's anger and pain, because that's how they would be willing to listen to you. If you don't understand someone's pain and anger, they will not listen to you. So that's the first step I would take, and then understand the reasons, what makes them upset. Is it the cause, or is it the way that cause is executed? So, you know, the protesters looting, is that the cause of anger, or is the protest itself is an anger? You know, is that the reason of anger? And I think those are some starting steps to address this problem.
Great suggestions, Devendra. It is a complex situation. Now, anybody else want to tackle this one? Any of the other presenters? All right, I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next question then, because we got a lot of questions here. So I want to have a chance for all the voices to be heard. And Ally, this question is actually for you. It's how did you decide on your research topic, and what was the process like to get started on research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had been interested in Brazil for a while. My family's hosted a couple Brazilian exchange students, so I was always like, "Ooh, this is a really interesting country and culture." So that's kind of like how I chose like Brazil. But I really got involved with the research project and really honing in on that topic. So I was in a class with Dr. Kristen Smith, who also became my thesis advisor. You can look her up. She is at UT Austin. She does incredible work in Brazil. And I took that class with her. It was a class on Black women specifically, and that kind of really inspired me. And I guess the process, I asked if I could help on one of her research projects, and she said, yeah, sure. So that's how I really got introduced to that process of getting involved in research. And I think that's something that, y'all can do with your professors. If you took an awesome class, or, even if you didn't take a class with a professor and you just see, you look at professors in a department, doesn't even have to be your own department. You can be like, oh, this person, your research is really interesting. Are you looking for any volunteer research assistants? So I think that's a good way. And if you want to kind of conduct your own research, you can see if your department has an honors thesis program, or if you're in, maybe I'm more familiar with the social sciences, but if you're in more of like the hard sciences, you can also ask professors what that process looks like. And lastly, I wanted to just say that there are so many scholarships for undergraduate research that just a lot of people don't know about. So just look around your university and your department from other departments, and just see what's out there. Because my research, I went to Brazil for 2 weeks, and my whole trip and everything was covered from scholarships that I received just because I applied and reached out to people that were offering this free money to me. But you just have to look for it, because sometimes it can be hard to find. So yeah, that's kind of all I have to say. And I can leave my email in the comments or in the chat if anyone's interested in talking about this. I know I don't go to your university, but I can maybe guide for different things that you may be interested in.
Great, thanks, Ally. And if you don't mind leaving your email, that would be great. I'll just say that there absolutely are resources here at the University of Tennessee to support undergraduate researchers. And so Ally can give you some tips on how to approach professors, but you can certainly contact professors within your own department to find out more about what's available for you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. This one is from Jamar Coach. It says, with the increase of foreign interference in our political discourse, how can activist circles keep their doors open enough for people to join in while keeping out interference? I think that's a great question. I'm going to actually ask Devendra maybe to start with that one, because I think it's a little bit of a technical question, which is more his expertise, but then the others can add in as well.
So I'm reading Jamar's comment that says, often there is less legislative action here. And I think there are many people who are interested, but they have less power. And there are many people who have a lot of power, but they are very least interested. So you need to be strategic in engaging with stakeholders, identifying their power and their interest, and how do you communicate with those different stakeholders? How frequently do you want to grab their attention? What kind of language, vocabulary they understand. If they understand academic vocabulary, use it, master it. If academic vocabulary repels people who have a lot of interest but less power, then be that way. You have to speak the language understood by different stakeholders who have different levels of power and interest. So that's a starting point.
Great.
Thanks.
Anybody else want to add on to that? All right, I'll go on to the next question. This one's from Garrett Jude Walker. He says, how could digital activism be more effective than any other type of activism? Digital activism has had a huge impact on the BLM movement. Do you think without social media, would BLM have made these strides so quickly? I'm actually going to give that one to Jasmine, because I think you addressed that a little bit in your opening or in your remarks, but you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so like I was saying, the reason why I think sometimes, at least, digital activism can be more effective than your traditional forms of activism is because it can definitely transcend some of the boundaries that we see in activism, right? So it's of my belief that there's a little bit of kind of like what Ed was saying, an activist culture. Like, what does an activist look like? What are the tools? And so with social media, again, that's predicated on the notion that you have access to social media. It can really transcend some of those boundaries and those limitations that we have traditionally seen in traditional forms, again, of activism. And I think also when we look at the type of audiences of social media, and seems like I froze a little bit.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
The types of audiences that we see on social media and the fact that minoritized individuals use social media for that purpose a lot more than what we might see in other forms of activism. I think that's another reason why that digital activism as a whole can be a little more, I don't want to say advantageous, but it's just a different way of engaging in civic participation. And again, it really can serve as a microphone for people who just kind of want to excel, right? It really disrupts this traditional form of communication that we see, that we've historically seen, which is more so vertical communication, where it's a very top-down approach in creating messages, right? So it wasn't that long ago when we had to wait until 5 or 6 o'clock to get the news, right? Or we had to wait into the morning to get the newspaper. We all on this session can be breaking news producers in a way, because we have that platform. And so it's more of a horizontal way of communication. And you couple that with an activist agenda, I mean, that can have powerful implications.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. There is a ton of additional great questions and comments in chat, so feel free to continue to take a look at those for a few minutes. And this session is being recorded, so you can go back and look at it later if you wish. They'll be on the YouTube channel later. Right now, I know Ms. Alice Worth would like to make a few comments as we close this session. So, Ms. Worth, the time is yours.
Okay, first of all, I just want to thank this distinguished panel from all around the country sharing their information. I learned a lot. And our moderator, you, Sally McMillan, for sharing with us. I know we could go on and on. I'm learning. I feel like I'm in the classroom. This medium platform is so great. I wish we had more time, but I want to just thank you guys. I am the chair of our Diversity Inclusion Week, and I just want to thank all that participated today, and to also to share with you, we have our keynote panel coming up, a celebration or a tribute to Congressman John Lewis. And we have the Reverend Middlebrook, who marched with him, as well as with Martin Luther King. Theodore Robinson, our first African-American to attend the University of Tennessee on that, and Ms. Phyllis Nichols, who is the CEO for the Urban League. And then we have Women of Change agents later from 210 to 310. And then we have Citizens Safety in a Perilous Time. We just have a platform that we are rolling out, and you don't want to miss it. In addition, Thursday, we have our festival. It will not be the usual hamburgers and food, but it's going to be virtual from spoken word fashions around the country or the world. So stay tuned, stay with us. We are rolling out great things, and I'm just so proud of our executive committee and planning all these different things. Everyone, we are community, building community. This is our 11th year, and I'm just so proud of every individual that has been a part. I also want to remind you, please take time to evaluate. Because of you, we can continue rolling out wonderful information for each and every one to enrich our lives and to make us better ambassadors for change. Again, distinguished panel, thank you. And Sally, thank you for doing an excellent job. All of you, thank you so much.